Chapter 13, Critical Thinking and Moral Reasoning. Now, this is one of my favorite topics within philosophy, the area where I decided to specialize along with social and political philosophy, because it's where philosophy could be most practical, most actionable, most useful to persons. Critical thinking in general is good for everything in life, but here's where the rubber hits the road, so to speak. Now, you might ask, what makes a claim a moral claim? Well, just listen for certain key words. For example, allowing biological men to compete in women's sports is immoral. Working on the Sabbath is wrong. It's unethical to force religious beliefs on non-believing citizens via the state. Capitalism is inherently unjust. You listen for keywords such as these, or should, or ought, or should not, ought not, so long as it's not being used in a predictive sense, such as it should rain tomorrow, but instead you should give to charity if you're wealthy, then you know it's a moral claim. Now, as critical thinkers, we don't just want to accept moral claims. We want to ask ourselves, what are the reasons behind this moral claim? What's the argument supporting it? Because that strength of the argument will give us reason to be compelled to follow it or not. Here's a very basic moral argument. Premise one, using artificial intelligence to write your English composition essay is dishonest. Premise two, here's a moral premise. Dishonesty is immoral. Conclusion three, therefore, using AI to write your English comp essay is immoral. So there could be other reasons that might counterbalance this. There might be ways to ethically use AI. But if you simply say, AI, here's my prompt, please write this for me, and you submit it as your own without the professor's authorization and with the understanding that you're the one supposed to write it, that would be dishonest. And if you agree that dishonesty in general, in most cases, as a rule of thumb, is immoral, then this would also be a basic moral argument. Now, critical thinkers, of course, seek moral truth, just as we seek truth about the world around us, the physical world and such. And there are several different possible sources we can seek out where we can seek the answers to moral questions. One that Herrick really doesn't address is religion. I think he sets religion aside for a couple of different reasons. One, just to be respectful. No reason to criticize religion if you don't have to. But number two, because religion is always based on an element of faith. If there weren't a leap of faith required, we would call it history rather than religion. And so, as critical thinkers who answer questions with reasons and logic, you're not going to find too much guidance in a book about critical thinking by an academic philosopher that would recommend or give you any real advice on how to use religion to answer moral questions. Now, of course, many people, of course, do, and that's completely fine. It's up to you. You might think about the reasons why you believe from a critical thinking perspective. There are philosophical arguments out there that do support the existence of a deity. There are arguments of varying strengths that support particular religions. You're encouraged to think about those on your own. But one thing that you can do is that you can use the philosopher's approach to morality to help you interpret your religious understanding and to help you answer questions that your religion may not directly speak to. I doubt there's any holy book anywhere that speaks to how we should safely develop and utilize artificial intelligence. Now, of course, you can infer things about being honest and how you use AI to write your English composition essay or not. But what about any moral restraints there might be on creating something that is going to be more intelligent and possibly more powerful than human beings? What about how we should treat those entities if they were to come to give us reason to think that they're actually conscious and can feel? We can infer different principles from moral text, but the way that we do that and apply it to these new situations, another new situation might be utilization of artificial wombs. Some people think that artificial wombs are a fantastic win-win that would allow us to both enable choice and life at the same time, which means if a woman didn't want to be pregnant anymore, she wouldn't have to choose between carrying a pregnancy that she doesn't want to, or for whatever reason might be risky, or terminating that pregnancy via an abortion. But instead, it could be transplanted into an artificial womb and then gestated there. So you would have both choice and life. I know of no religious text that says anything at all about that possible permissible usage of an artificial womb. You're going to need to use your good sense to think through various principles. And so this is why the philosopher's approach can be helpful. We're going to consider a couple of different angles. One that we considered in a previous chapter is our personal views, what we personally believe. Another one is what our culture believes. And then there are a couple of different approaches that are similar to the approaches that philosophers take to epistemology, or what constitutes genuine knowledge. Bottom-up considered moral judgments to derive a principle, a top-down a priori principle to apply to particular situations, or reflective equilibrium. We're going to go back and forth between these principles and these examples in the world, have them inform one another, and possibly give you the best all things considered view. But first, recall that the absurd implications of personal moral relativism. And this was a reductio ad absurdum argument where we consider, well, what if we just allowed each person to be their own author of fully legitimate moral claims? And whatever they believe, if they sincerely believe it, it must be true for them. Well, that would mean that if someone sincerely believed sneaking into your bathroom and brushing a skunk with your toothbrush would be okay, it really would be okay for them. That's a silly example, but imagine if a person thought it was okay to kidnap and torture you. And if they sincerely believed it was okay to kidnap and torture you, well, if you're a moral relativist, a personal moral relativist, you would have to say, well, it really is okay for them. But I can't see you being tortured and saying this is okay. Of course, you would protest, not just because you don't want it to happen, but because you would say this is immoral, this isn't just, this is unethical, this is wrong. You can pretty clearly and directly see that from your moral sense, which we'll talk about in just a second, but that's one good reason to reject moral relativism. And it's also the case that if we were personal moral relativists, we would have to say people are already infallible authors of moral truth, and so there would be no way to improve. All of us have improved morally over the course of our lives, or at least we've waxed and waned, and we can say that at this particular period in our life, we were acting more ethically than this other one, and hopefully we're on a path towards improvement over time. But if you were a moral relativist on a personal level, you would have to say, well, there's never any improvement. It's always just whatever that person believes. Similar reasons would give us a reason to reject cultural moral relativism. That's the view that whatever your culture says is what's morally correct. And this would require the obedience to one rule: obey whatever your society believes. Whatever the society's norms are, you must do that and never criticize it. And you may be quite comfortable with your culture's views right now, but just imagine if you were to move to another country or to have been born in another country where they practice things differently. Would you say that female genital mutilation is okay just because that's what they do in that particular country, or indentured servitude is okay just because that's what they do? And you might say that if you're not a woman who might be subjected to this practice, and if you're not a person who's going to be enslaved and subjected to that practice, but just imagine that you were a woman and you would be possibly cut up in this way, or you might be an untouchable and born into some sort of a servile position in society. Surely you wouldn't say that that's cool. And we just have to follow what the culture says. This also similarly precludes moral improvement. If your culture's current views determine moral truth, then you can't say there's been any progress over time. Surely most of us would agree that the fact that the United States, for example, allows women to vote and no longer allows slavery is an improvement over time. And of course, this would also endorse terrible things such as that old classic slavery or honor killings, which you see in India sometimes, and also genocide, which we've seen in Africa and, of course, in Germany. Now, what we're looking for, since we're going to reject this relativistic approach, we're looking for reasonable moral principles, principles that we can endorse as critical thinkers, as thoughtful people. These are going to be principles that can be supported with reasons, with some argumentation that we can examine and either endorse or reject. And they're going to need to be impartial and universal. We're going to be able to grant and only grant exceptions for rules when we have really good reason to make those exceptions. Otherwise, we're going to treat like cases alike. And why might that be the case? Well, just reflect on the nature of morality. Talk more about your moral intuition here in just a second, but you can test these moral principles against actual instances in the world and then improve those principles, or possibly edge closer to what objective moral truth really is. Now, in order to do that, you're going to need to have some moral sense. And the good thing is, we're all born with a moral sense. We all have the capacity for empathy. We also have moral intuition. Herrick doesn't talk a whole lot about moral intuition using that particular term. I do. So I just want to distinguish between Herrick's approach and my approach. But what he does say is that empathy enables the consideration of the impact of our actions on others. We can see things from the perspective, we can get inside through their eyes. We can imagine ourselves in their shoes. And therefore, that allows us to see how they're going to be benefited or harmed. And then we can adjust our own behavior, taking their interests into account. This just seems to be an explanation of what it means to be a moral thinker and to make decisions with morality in mind. Our moral intuition, this is something that ethicists necessarily need in order to do ethics at all. It's a necessary input into the moral reasoning process. And it's just simply this sense that we all have inside of us. We consider a particular example and we have a reaction to it, an emotional reaction to it. Now, that doesn't mean that whatever our initial first blush emotional reaction is to something, that's what we should necessarily go with. That makes the most sense. In some cases, our moral intuition is going to be incorrect. We have been conditioned one way or the other. We haven't considered variables and factors that would give us reason to adjust our perspective, but it is definitely useful and important and necessary if you're going to do moral reasoning. And here's a quote from Herrick back on empathy. He says, feelings and empathy need to be checked by reason. They'll be put in conversation with one another, while reason in turn needs to be checked by feelings and empathy. So they work together. If you just had logical principles, you'd never be able to get to the point where you would say this or that is ethical or unethical, or right or wrong. You should or you should not do it. You're going to have that emotional component to get you there, but you also at the same time want to use your good sense to do so. And I've got a little footnote there that says Herrick emphasizes empathy, but not moral intuition. He just doesn't use that term, but I do when I teach ethics. And so do lots of other folks. So here's one way to go about doing ethics from a philosophical perspective. And it's the bottom up particular to general. So you're going to look at particular cases and try to derive some general principle. So you're going to take some considered moral judgments, those that you make under the ideal conditions. You're very cool, you're calm, you're collected, your mind is focused and free of distractions. You've objectively considered all the relevant facts and principles multiple times. You really analyzed a case, and you're certain your judgment is correct with no reason whatsoever to doubt it. If you've done that and you've actually went through that process, now you can say this thing that you now believe is a considered moral judgment. And then you can use that moral judgment in concert with other similar moral judgments to derive a moral principle. And here's a particular example of something Herrick uses. It's morally wrong to shoot a person to test the accuracy of a pistol. And reflect that on that for a while and say, that would be a very terrible way to test the accuracy of a pistol. Shoot an innocent person, I can shoot a target instead and cause no harm. That person would feel the pain, their family would feel distress, it could ruin their life, etc. You might also agree that it's morally wrong to shoot a person because they cut you off in traffic. It would seem to be a trivial reason to threaten somebody's life with a gunshot. It seems a very silly reason. Perhaps it was dangerous. I suspect that you yourself are not a perfect driver, so perhaps you should grant others grace whenever they cut you off and say, hey, buddy, please be more careful, but in any case, don't go over the top and shoot them. You probably also agree that it's morally wrong to shoot a person because you don't like their religion or the color of their skin. These seem to be superficial things, especially skin color. That's something we don't choose. It's something we're just simply born into. And in many cases, we're born into our religion as well. And if a person wants to believe this religion or that religion, as long as it doesn't interfere with you, doesn't seem to be much reason why you would want to shoot them. Wouldn't be a very good justification for that. So you can take a look at these specific considered moral judgments and then extract from them the general principle that, drum roll, it's morally wrong to kill someone with a gun in this particular case when they are not threatening or harming anyone. Seems pretty common sense, but that's how it's done. You look at specific cases and you extract a principle. Now, there's another way to go from this, and this is the top down. You've got the principle and you apply it to particular cases. And here, moral philosophers who defend a foundational a priori moral principles argue that our introspective moral experience reveals that our intellects are capable of a direct a priori grasp of objective moral truth. For example, from our own Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That sounds very much like hey, this is something that we didn't need to go out in the world and look for. It's just self-evident. And in this case, they're crediting a creator with this self-evident moral principle. But this is just an example. Hey, this is a principle that we see we're not really going to argue for. We're just going to say that it's obvious that this is true, and now we're going to go from there. The problem with that is a person could stipulate any moral principle as obviously true. And if you disagree with them, they could say, well, this is obvious to me, but it's not obvious to you. So what you can do instead, which is superior, is to use reflective equilibrium. This is when you're going to go from the top-down principles and the bottom-up examples, and then they're going to go back and forth, and they're constantly going to inform one another, just like the way that we view the world, our perspective, can shape the way that we interpret phenomena in the world, and what we experience in the world can shape our overall view of the world. Similarly, our moral principles, initial moral principles, can inform the way that we judge cases, moral scenarios, and whenever we judge those moral scenarios, sometimes it might give us reason to revise these moral principles. And what you're trying to do here is to go back and forth between these until they've reached stability or a moral equilibrium. So here you got the considered moral judgments, they influence and inform moral principles, and they do the other way, vice versa. It's a constant back and forth, seeking coherent, unified moral system. And the process, this is a quote from Herrick, the process is theoretically complete and real moral knowledge is attained when an equilibrium is reached and no further adjustments between particular judgments and general principles is reasonably called for. You get to those. There's also something called wide reflective equilibrium that you could do in political philosophy, where you contrast your judgments with the judgments of other citizens, and you're involved in that conversation with them, and their views and their arguments shape yours, and your views and your arguments shape them. And when it's the case, when citizens can come very close together, that's wide reflective equilibrium. That's something that an ideal political philosophy would be looking for, because none of us is perfect in isolation, and surely thinking together come up with better views. Okay, here's a couple of ethical theories. There's also four dominant ethical theories. The two that aren't covered here are virtue ethics and feminist care ethics. I cover those in my ethics class. Feel free to take it sometime or read my Ethics in a Nutshell, The Philosopher's Approach to Morality in 100 pages. You can find it on audiobook on YouTube for free, and I'll send you the PDF for free if you want to read it. Just shoot me an email. But the two that Herrick does consider are utilitarianism and Kantianism. And here they are with some basic details about them. And then I'll apply these to a particular case in just a second to show the distinction between them. So utilitarianism popularized by Bentham and Mill. The basic moral imperative here is that you should maximize net pleasure. Pick whatever options can bring about the most pleasure overall. You need to weigh that for all the different impacted parties. And so when you're asking yourself, what should I do? Well, it's whatever will bring about the most pleasure overall. It's not what's the most pleasure for you. It's not selfish egoism. And it's not democracy either, because sometimes people vote for things that really don't make them happiest, or it doesn't make the culture overall happiest. So don't confuse it with democracy or egoism. It's whatever would bring about the most pleasure overall, which sometimes would require self-sacrifice. The strength of utilitarianism is that it's systematic and measurable. When I used to teach or help teach engineering ethics at the University of Tennessee, the engineering students loved utilitarianism because they could put numbers on things and run calculations. But a weakness is that it's sometimes tough to quantify. How do we quantify the amount of pleasure a person gets from eating a candy bar, or from going to the movies, or from seeing a loved one that they've not seen in a long time? And there's also the difficulty of comparing pleasure and pain between persons. So I may get a whole lot of enjoyment out of Cadbury cream egg, whereas the next person may just get a little bit of enjoyment. We may show outwardly the same type of satisfaction, but inwardly it may be a lot more intense for me than for them. So it's hard to put numbers on pleasure and pain and actually run a clear, defendable calculation using utilitarianism. But you do the best you can with what you have. But the other ethical system is called Kantianism, popularized by 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant. And there were two rules that came out of Kantianism. There are several different ones, but the two most popular formulations of his so-called categorical imperative, fancy term, it just means treat other people as ends in themselves, which means with respect and never as if they're a mere tool for you to utilize however you see fit, but instead as a person. And also only do things that you could universalize, only do things that you could rationally will everyone else do in similar circumstances. A little bit complicated. If you learn more about it, take my ethics class or read my book, but there's the quick and dirty for this critical thinking class. When you're asking yourself, what should you do from the Kantian perspective, you're going to say whatever treats persons with respect and also could be universalized in similar circumstances. The strength of this is that it has a very high threshold, a very high bar has to be met before you can do anything, cause any harm to other persons. So it treats persons with intrinsic dignity and respect, whereas utilitarianism, well, you might be able to justify, for example, enslaving blue-eyed persons if it brings about the most pleasure overall, because there aren't that many people with blue eyes. And so if we were to enslave them, they would be miserable, but everybody else would be very happy. So perhaps all things considered, from a utilitarian perspective, that would be okay. But from a Kantian perspective, no person, no rational agent should ever be treated as a mere thing. And so there would be a prohibition against that from that perspective. And people consider that to be a strength if you're serious about the value of the individual person. But then one weakness is that sometimes it's difficult to apply. It can be very inflexible. You can say on some interpretations, you should never lie. There's a famous example of there being an axe murderer at the door, and he's banging on the door and saying, "Is Professor Matt in there?" And I'm in the back going, "Don't tell him, don't tell him." From a Kantian perspective, the best you could do is just remain silent. You couldn't say, no, Professor Matt's not in here because that would be lying. That's not something you could universalize. That's a strict interpretation of Kantianism, but that is considered one of the weaknesses. Now, let's apply these two ethical theories to the same case. Say there's a 5-acre lakeside lot, and the question is, how should it be used? And there's some developers, and they want to have a nice lakefront community with some mansions. They want to sell those mansions to a select number of wealthy individuals and then use that money however they see fit. But then there's some other folks in the community who want to override those developers and instead take that land through eminent domain or whatever other legal processes and turn it into a public park. So let's think through those options from these two ethical theories. So the right thing to do from the utilitarian perspective is whatever will maximize net happiness, most happiness overall. The private developers who own it would temporarily employ builders, and a few wealthy families would then enjoy their nice homes. But if it were turned into a nice public park, everyone in the community, or I guess anybody that was willing to travel there, would be able to use it for generations to come. That's a whole lot of pleasure, I would think, all that time into the future. So a public park would generate more net pleasure. Therefore, it should be developed into a park. Now let's look at it from the Kantian perspective, on one interpretation anyway. So here, the right thing to do is whatever treats persons with respect and whatever can be universalized. Taking a person's legitimately acquired property without their consent would be treating them as a mere tool, as a thing to be used, and probably couldn't be universalized. And so therefore, whoever owns the lot, in this case the developers, should decide for themselves how to use it, independent of net pleasure pain considerations. So a Kantian perspective is going to give us more reasons to respect the developer's property rights in this case. Although you can also take a rule utilitarian perspective that you should, in most cases, respect property rights and legal property. That's for a more in-depth class. However, I wanted to also clarify that from the Kantian perspective, there have been different reasonable interpretations when applied to the political realm. The very first work of philosophy I ever read, full book, was Anarchy, State, and Utopia by political philosopher Robert Nozick. And it was recommended by a philosophy professor at Pellissippi State. And what Nozick argues in there from a Kantian perspective is that when you're thinking about property ownership and wealth distribution, taxation and such, according to whatever a person has been able to earn through voluntary exchange, that's the standard that you should use. So if you had what is oftentimes called a free market, one person was able to accumulate a lot of wealth, okay, and if another person didn't accumulate any wealth whatsoever, you wouldn't have any grounds on which to tax this person and then provide programs or direct payments to this other program, because that would be treating them as a mere tool and not as a person in and of themselves. That's an oversimplification of a very elegant and complicated book. That's the point that Herrick focuses on in his books. That's the point I'll focus on right now. But then later in my college career, whenever I got to the University of Tennessee and also in my graduate work for my PhD, I studied John Rawls, and he wrote A Theory of Justice and several other political philosophy books. And he also takes Kantian angle, but he argues that wealth and income should be distributed equally unless an unequal distribution would benefit the least advantaged group. And he uses a very ingenious thought experiment called the veil of ignorance, where he asks these people to be completely self-interested and selfish, and they're theoretical people, but he blocks them from knowing who they are, whether they're rich or poor, whether they're white, black, Asian, etc., whether they're a man or a woman, whether they're very smart or not too smart at all, whether they're handsome or not so handsome, or good looking or not so good looking, whether they are a Christian or Hindu or Muslim or Jewish or agnostic or atheist, whether they live under a bridge or whether they're a billionaire, block them from knowing all these things. And then he asks them, what political principles could you endorse? What type of a state could you endorse, not knowing who you are? And then he argues that the answer that you get from people behind that veil of ignorance, from that perspective, that's going to be the most fair and the most ethically just answer. And this is the best way to treat persons with respect, is to follow what these people behind the veil of ignorance would endorse. And he thinks they would endorse equality of wealth and income unless an unequal distribution could benefit the least well-off group. And he makes a good case that it certainly could by structuring the economy in ways to give people incentives to work hard. And so what if the people don't have the same amount of things as long as they're better off than they would have been under strict egalitarianism or equal distribution, they don't have any grounds of which to complain. That's for a political philosophy class, but there's also some lecture videos out there by yours truly, that cool argument. All right, does critical thinking make any practical difference in the real world? Herrick uses the example. I mean, you do have those two examples from the libertarian Rawlsian perspective, which definitely influence political movements. But also, Herrick uses the example that Mill and his wife Harriet were activists for women's suffrage, for the right to vote. Kant's arguments helped fuel the abolitionist anti-slavery movement. It was also used by civil rights activists in the United States whenever that movement came about. And both utilitarianism and Kantianism have influenced movements for workers' rights and representative government. So yes, it can and does make a practical difference in the real world. That's one of my favorite topics in philosophy. I hope you enjoyed it well. I hope you'll continue to study a little bit more. I'll put a link to my audiobook on ethics in a nutshell down in the comments. Next chapter is going to be the final chapter, and that glorious final chapter is going to be on critical thinking, worldviews, and the examined life.